coming, and thanks a lot to Dylon for having me here today. This is really a pleasure to be here. And yeah, so I want to talk about the option that we have on the private side, totally new this year. And it's a partnership we developed. So my name is Josh Perlman. I'm from Praedictus Climate Solutions. We partnered with Diversified Crop Insurance Services to offer this policy. So it's really, DCIS is the one offering the policy. We're the ones who did all the modeling behind it and structuring of the policy. So that's kind of how the roles break down. So let's get into it. Just a little background about my company. We are an advanced crop modeling company. So our background is in doing kind of simulation models of crops, integrating all the weather data to look at yields of all sorts of crops all around the world. We have a really deep experience in modeling crops in the US and globally. And we really specialize in modeling crop yields where there's not a lot of historical data around. So hemp was a really cool case. That's kind of how we got involved in this is, a lot of times we might be working in wheat in India where, wheat's a pretty common crop, but the data sources over there are a little bit shaky. And so it's important to kind of have an alternative model to see what historically happened. So in the case of hemp in the US, obviously, there's not a whole lot of historical data to the legal status of it. And that's where we really kind of found this good fit with DCIS. How could we offer something? How could we use our technology to make data, essentially, in order to build a policy that would work? So I want to talk about just some of the main overall program highlights. The first thing, of course, on everyone's mind, price, right? So what is the price? Well, that luckily is very, very, very simple with this product. It's a flat 12% rate on line of whatever value you want to insure across the board. So you can basically figure out very easily what your quote would be just by multiplying 12% by whatever value you want. It's a really, really flexible policy. It's unriddled by restrictions or price limits, coverage limits. There are no limits at this point. It's possible down the road that there may be some, but at this point, it's pretty much whatever amount you want. So that's a really, really nice feature of the policy, especially given kind of the values that we've been hearing that some folks might really need coverage for.
Josh, do you have to, how do you come up with those values for coverage? How does that work? Do they get to pick what they want as far as coverage levels?
They absolutely pick what they want. So just that's as simple as that. If you want $10,000 an acre, $20,000, $50,000, up, that's okay. And thirdly, and in some sense, most importantly, we really believe this is a reliable product, providing kind of really good true protection against weather-related production losses. So it doesn't cover everything. It doesn't cover every single possible. It's defined, and I'll get into some more specifics on that. But as far as the basic weather variables that would affect your yield, we have a really good policy here. And let me give you a little bit more detail on that. So like I mentioned, the price again, it's a very flat rate. I think what I want to say is that the single price covers multiple weather variables. So it's kind of nice that Dylon talked about e-weather risk right before getting into my talk here, because the program is similar to e-weather risk in some sense that it's parametric. That's kind of where the similarities end. The difference is we're not looking just at individual weather variables and measuring them kind of in isolation. It's integrating them all together. The model is integrating them all to actually simulate historical yields and say how do they actually affect yield. So it's hard. There was a good question before about, well, how do I know what level of rainfall to choose and at what time of year, and how much is that going to cost me for how long? You don't have to worry about any of that in this case. Something like e-weather, I'm not saying it's bad. It might be great if you already know exactly what time frame and what weather variable is really important to you, and you're saying, I just want to look at these 2 weeks for this amount of precipitation. If you get too much, it's going to be, that's going to be really bad. But if you want something that kind of covers the whole season and does the work for you of integrating how all these variables interact to affect yield, this policy is going to be a lot more this is going to be really cost effective and also kind of take care of all of that kind of thinking. Like I said again, the no limits on insured value is a really nice feature. And just to give you a sense of the structure of how the policies work, they're written per county and farmer practice. And by farmer practice, I mean what the planting date is, and whether it's irrigated or not irrigated. So a policy would be defined as irrigated hemp, Jackson County, planted on June 1st. That would be an example of like a single policy to how it's defined. And also, of course, feel free to stop me at any time if there are questions. A little bit more, getting into a little bit more detail about how it works. Again, it's parametric, just in that sense, kind of similar to the e-weather's product, meaning it's defined at that county, county planting date, irrigation practice level. So it's really across the board per county. What the model says happened there relative to history defines whether you get a payout or not. It doesn't have anything to do with actual on-farm production, so it's purely parametric in that sense. Kind of expanding on this point of how we get the data to build the model. The model is making that data historically, and that very same model is used to settle the policy in the current year. So we run the weather data all back through time, through the model. We get a yield for each year historically, and that's what structures the policy. Then, in the current year, in 2020, at the end of the year, we run the model again. That shows us where everything falls relative to the history and the policy that's been structured, and that's what determines your payout. So it's very, very, very kind of straightforward. This third point is what I really want to emphasize. So this is, yes, the weather data, weather is what's kind of driving differences in yield from year to year, but this isn't just a weather model. It's not just measuring weather data. This is actually about hemp. That's where it's a big distinction from just kind of a weather index. We actually work with top agronomists who study hemp and kind of tailored our modeling platform so that it reflects the agronomy of the hemp plant, the phenology, how it grows, the life cycle, all that kind of stuff. So we're running the weather data through this agronomic understanding to really, and that's how we get the yields from year to year through the model. And so specifically, the variables that are taken into account here, of course, temperature, precipitation, and solar radiation. Those are the weather variables that are taken into account. So all of those are essentially baked in, and you can say are baked in and covered under this policy for that 12% price. And it's all outcomes of those variables. So it's not like you have to say, oh, well, I'm just worried about too much precip, but I also might be worried about too little precipitation. It's all outcomes of all those variables. It's all factoring into what the yield is. All the interactions between the variables and the plant are kind of accounted for. And so again, you don't have to kind of think about, well, am I covered for too much precipitation or too little? It's all kind of baked in. Yeah?
Would the fire be covered under this and smoke?
No.
Under the solar radiation, though?
No. Very important. So there are clear kind of limitations to what this covers. So it's not going to cover, obviously not going to cover hail. Doesn't cover wind damage. Doesn't cover fire. There's a lot of things it doesn't cover. It's really about these variables and their effect on yield.
But
Solar radiation.
What is solar radiation?
What's up?
What is solar radiation?
Well, solar radiation is basically it's energy coming from the sun. So actually, in certain places, this is maybe an issue in more in some places than in others, of course. But like sometimes if it's too cloudy, it actually affects yield because you just don't get the photosynthesis.
Smoke does the same thing though. It really cuts down on the solar radiation enormously.
Right, so that's a good,
okay,
so that's actually a really, really good point. So I can look into in a little bit more detail, the solar radiation data that we use to see to what extent, because to the extent that it's picking up on events that cause smoke that would decrease solar radiation, then that will be reflected in here. So I can verify that.
Because out here in the Pacific Northwest, forest fires are huge.
Right.
So
we get a smoke all summer.
No? Right. You gotta remember he's back in Washington DC.
Yeah, we don't, there's droughts when you have like 20 inches of precipitation a year.
But it also affects taste.
Yeah.
Everything.
So as far so that's a really, really good question. So to the extent if kind of smoke were to or if fire were to be baked in any way, it would be through that mechanism, I suppose. I never even thought of that, but yeah. And our solar radiation data should be picking up on that because it's basically measuring incident solar radiation. So if it's being reflected back out, just like if you have a cloud, I mean, it should be the same thing. So I'll look a little deeper into that, but I would assume that that would be captured. Yes.
Right. Just for your information, in 1987, in Hemp Camp on the Klamath River, we had a 365,000 acre fire.
Yeah.
The temperature in August, late August to early September, dropped into 35 degrees and stayed there for 28 days.
Oh, wow.
So you get mold on everything. There's nothing survives.
Okay. All right. Well, that's a great point, and I never thought of that. So I'll verify that. But certainly, it's the same way that clouds reflect sunlight and smoke will, and so that shouldn't make any difference as far as how it's captured in the model. So a little bit of this is overlap to what I just said, but again, I just want to hammer home the point that we really did make a great effort here to tailor this model to hemp, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this later as we move on in the next couple of slides, because we know that hemp is a new crop. There's all sorts of varietals, all sorts of growing practices out there. It's still kind of wide open. It varies hugely geographically. So obviously, what you're doing here is going to be way different than what people are doing in Kentucky. And so, there's a lot to account for. I'm not saying we've accounted for every little single detail difference everywhere. And in fact, to be honest, there will probably be plenty of you who take a look at this and say, hey, this doesn't quite match up with what I'm doing. But the key is we actually have the capacity in various ways to improve on that. And I'll get into that as well. This just is kind of a diagram of a rough diagram of how the model works. And what I just want to emphasize from this is that, again, we're accounting for more than weather. We're also taking into account what soils are in the particular location. We're making some hopefully reasonable assumptions about management practices. Again, translating the weather data into a perspective on what we think yield should have been historically. Now, I wanted to say a little bit about how settlement of the policy is going to work, because that's all important. I mean, because obviously that's how you get paid out. So, again, all payouts are determined by county, plus the farmer's choice of kind of planting date and irrigation practice. Again, so that's kind of the fundamental unit. All of the yields that come out of the model historically and in the current year are going to be normalized to the historical 10-year trailing average. So when we talk about percent of normal yield, we're talking about percent of the previous 10 years. That's what we're defining as normal. The interesting part about this policy and what makes it, so you say, well, how do you have the same rate everywhere? How can you have the same rate everywhere? Well, the way this policy works is, yeah, it's the same rate everywhere, but how the policy triggers and then subsequently reaches a full payout differs per county and irrigation practice and planting date. So in each of those cases, depending on what the historical, what the history of the crop has been in that county, in some places it's going to be attached at a much higher percentage of normal, and in some cases it's going to be much lower. So in the place where you have really stable yields every year, right, the policy might start paying out at like 99% of normal. It might be right at normal is where it starts paying out. And you might reach a full payout at only like 5% below normal, right? But in a county where the weather is, when it tends to be really unstable, maybe the soils aren't so great, there's a lot of variability. Well, to reach a payout, you might have to go down to 15% below normal to start paying out, and then might not finish paying out. You might not reach a full payout till 50% below normal or something like that. So it varies specific to the county planting date and irrigation practice. Now, I want to, first, before I talk about this, just preface it by saying we have a web page that has a lot of this information where you can actually go for your county and your planting date and your irrigation practice for the policy that you would be interested in. You can go and you can look up the numbers for that policy, when it would have paid out historically, what it would have looked like. Dylan's going to send out the link to that website. I'll probably try to demo it really briefly here right after this slide. But Dylan's going to send out a link to that policy. The best course of action, the first thing to do would be to talk to Dylan, have him help you kind of navigate through the website, look at some policies that might, scenarios that might make sense for you, and just kind of get a lay of the land with him. That would be my first suggestion, to see if anything in this current program that you could buy today, right now, if there's something that would work for you. Because I think there's a good chance for quite a few folks there probably will be something, right? But you might find that the program, I don't quite like what I'm seeing, it doesn't quite work for me, maybe the payouts don't look quite right, or the practices that are available, maybe the planting dates don't quite match what I'm actually doing. Well, okay, so on the one hand, so maybe the policy won't work out of the box for you. On the other hand, it doesn't mean there won't be any options. There can be an option this year for you still. The way that could happen is basically by talking to Dylan and saying, hey, I don't really think, we've looked at this, I don't really think it quite works for me. This is how my growing operation actually looks. And this is what I would like to see in some kind of coverage for me. If we can get enough folks together who kind of want to participate in kind of some more customized program, that's something that we can definitely look at putting together. The basic information, I've kind of outlined here some of the basic information that would need to be, that we kind of need to get started on that. And so again, the best thing to do would be to work with Dylan and kind of give him that information. We can kind of take stock of who's interested in it and see what we can do. Certainly, I would like to point out that the more participants that we have, the more total insured value and the more kind of geographic spread that we would have, the better prices would be on such a kind of customized program. So that's definitely something that's something to keep in mind. And we would be really interested in kind of making this happen quickly, so that you would have some good option for 2020, even if the current program doesn't quite fit your needs. And I think that's about all I have on this. I think just really quickly, I want to show you what the website looks like. So here's the website. We basically just got some information, a lot of which I've gone over in the presentation. But you can see there's this little kind of interface here where you can basically choose your state, choose your practice, choose your county, planning date, and you can download some numbers. got some more information about us. If you want to see our pretty faces, there they are. And then again, a little bit more, just kind of the same stuff that I went over in the presentation. So that's there. I would encourage you, again, to get in touch with Dylon. He can go through all of this with you. And we can hopefully have a good option for you in 2020. And I think that's about it.